that freeway boss.
Oh shit! Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's gonna be fun then.
It was the toughest boss I faced the entire game.
Shit! Really?
Yeah.
I am so fucked.
Even the game's final boss, and I'm pretty sure you figured out who the final boss is already.
Yeah.
Even the game's final boss, I didn't die once doing that one.
Jeez, and you died 5 times against this freeway machine monster?
That actually reminds me because I remember the first time I played the original Final Fantasy VII, and I got onto Disc 3, and Disc 3 is the cave. It's the cave and Sephiroth.
Yep.
And, they give you a little crystal that you can put anywhere so you can save the game.
Yeah, I remember that.
I did not know that once you get past a certain point, you can't use that crystal.
Oh no! Oh no!
So I never used it when the Sephiroth battle started. And I actually, as luck would have it, didn't die and beat him without needing to save it. I got so fucking lucky.
Oh, thank goodness. I was so anxious hearing the second half of what you were saying. I was like, oh no, please don't tell me you had to start that freaking cave all over again.
You just remember...
I'm on the edge of my seat.
you remember old Sega games? I don't know if you had a Sega, I had a Sega. If you had 3 lives, and then if you lost all 3, unless your game had a password, you couldn't go back. You had to start all over again.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Or even in my broke young days, having a PS2 but with no memory card. You ever go through that struggle?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had one of the Gauntlet games for PS2 and no memory card. I just had the PS2 in the game, and so me and my friend Jonathan would try to just get as far into it every single time that we played, but we never got to the end because we could never save.
I had some games where they were just oh, you don't have a memory card, you can't play.
Oh, geez, really?
Yeah.
Well, because, I mean, don't know. I mean, this episode's sponsored by Canadias Yerba Mate.
Drink a yerba mate. It'll quench your thirst.
Hey, when did we get bought by Big T?
If we're
big
get...
big mate. Big mate.
Yeah, Big Mate. If we're going to get bought out by something, I guess it might as well be Big Mate. Possibly one of the least evil entities you can think of. As far as I know, anyway.
I mean, it's green gold, baby. Green gold.
Jesus. Anyway, Final Fantasy VII is great. I'm going to actually start to replay next week.
Oh, nice. This remake or the original?
The remake. I'm going to replay it when and actually put effort into the side quest.
Nice.
Because the only way, apparently I found out, it's the only way you can trigger the romance subplots.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
You have to do all of the side quests?
Well, no, you have to do certain side quests, and that triggers it for Tifa and Aerith.
Huh, okay. Dang, I didn't know that at all.
How you answer questions.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, shall we get started?
I think we should.
Yes, sir.
All right. All right, everybody. Welcome back to A Mouthful of History. As always, I am Nicholas Malott. Joined with me, Cameron Millage.
What's happening, everybody?
And our host for today, David Hollingsworth.
Hey, everyone. Hope you're doing well out there.
David, take it away.
All right. So I got the idea for this episode because I actually just finished reading a really good book. It's called The End of the Myth by Greg Grandin. And so the majority of the book is basically about the idea of the American frontier. So not necessarily the reality, but the idea of it. What it meant for the founders of this country, what it meant for different politicians, what it meant for the general population, just, the frontier as a symbol. I think it's a good topic because it gives us a really good through line for a lot of U.S. history. And then later on, when the frontier itself is ended, it becomes a sort of metaphor for things. So it kind of gives us an overview of all of American history. To kind of start things off, the general idea about the American frontier ever since the beginning of this country was that the frontier was a way to reduce a lot of problems by being free and living on the frontier as a rugged individual. There wouldn't be, racism, poverty, inequality, and extremism because there's not a big power struggle happening in the cities. Instead, people are just spreading outward. This is an idea that is really strongly articulated by a historian with the last name Turner that I'm going to let Cameron talk about.
This guy's name is Frederick Jackson Turner. I found out about him my junior year of college in my historical theory class at Cal State Fullerton. He is the man that was kind of like the godfather of Western history as we know today because of this whole idea of the frontier thesis. So he believed that the expansion of the frontier is what made America great.
Real quick, by the way, when you say Western, you mean like Western part of the U.S. and not West as in like Europe and the United States and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I mean Western United States.
Cool.
So
Sorry,
I guess I speak in broad paint strokes. This frontier thesis is sort of like what I would think that Turner was trying to make the origin story of the United States. Sort of like, not in a very marvelistic sense, but trying to give America its identity. It's expanded out of a few things, like he thought it'd be more democratic, he thought it'd be more egalitarian because Turner believed that if you remove yourself from all of those East Coast power structures that are generally European, the further out west you would go, it'd be distinctly American because you break off from that. This whole like frontierism that Turner talks about is generally more or less, it's nothing unique because you have to look at other European countries at the time like England and France. They were expanding themselves across the world. Jackson Turner was trying to put America in the same context, the same like colonial ambitions as pre-existing European powers.
Yeah, and so this guiding idea that Turner gives voice to, again, it's this idea that you can avoid these problems, again, things like class conflict, violence, extremism, by avoiding these structures that Cameron was just talking about, instead just unshackling yourself, going west, and just settling your own land. This wasn't part of the book, but I feel like an important thing to kind of say here is part of the reason actually that the land to the west was so fertile is because a lot of indigenous people who lived here before, they cultivated the land with really sophisticated land management techniques that made everything so fertile. There's a really good book called 1491 by Charles Mann, and it talks about this a little bit more, about how indigenous people worked the land and created a lot of self-sustaining, efficient agricultural practices that like made the land so good. So just an important kind of side note.
When it comes to Turner, like we talks about this whole idea of germ theory as well. What germ theory was that Germanic white people, they were able to become more democratic than like the Teutonic force of Germany, and then all of a sudden they just start pushing out west into Western Europe, and eventually those germs get to the colonies. But Turner actually didn't believe in that. He believed in a variant of it, but he believed that those germs were now more American than actually like this Germanic sort of germ stuff, but it's racist as hell. It sort of came out from this whole germ theory sort of ideal.
Yeah, and going off of the racism thing, it's an interesting kind of redefinition, I guess you could say, because germ theory posits that there's something innate within like the Germanic white person that makes them love freedom or whatever. Whereas the frontier thesis is externalizing it and saying, no, it's I'm not saying any one race is better than the other. I'm just saying that like the frontier is what makes everything wonderful. And so it's kind of taking that cause and externalizing it.
Well, he's simply putting American germs instead of Germanic germs. Like it's more American now than it is European.
Yeah, trying to take some of that shine basically and claim it for the US.
Ray Allen Billington criticized this frontier thesis, thinking it was his heresy that he wasn't talking about it in a very Germanic sense. Basically kind of saying it wasn't racist enough.
Yeah, so the guy is saying that like taking land and settling it, it's not racist enough. But that actually gets us into different ways of looking at the frontier other than the Turner thesis. This fella you might have heard of, Martin Luther King Jr., he flipped the Turner thesis on its head. he basically said that the constant outward expansion of the metaphorical frontier didn't so much not create these problems that Turner thinks the frontier helped avoid, but it actually just avoided those problems. It put them on the back burner. And so, you have these problems of poverty, racism, violence, etc., that the frontier was supposed to solve, but instead what the frontier, both the literal frontier during the 17 and 1800s, and then the metaphorical frontier during the 20th century and coming up to the present, that is actually just putting everything on the back burner and letting it fester, letting it get worse.
I feel like Turner neglected the South as well. Like he wanted to make it like a clean slate sort of ideal. He wanted to forget about the East Coast because it was European, and the South because he didn't want to address the ideas of slavery, and just wanted to be like, all right, everyone gets a clean slate when you move out west. But really, at this point, it's just what Turner like didn't put in is that all of those East Coast structures just shifted out west. So the frontier was more imitating rather than being innovative by any means in terms of this new democracy.
Exactly. And actually, it's good that you bring that up. We'll get to that in a little bit when we start talking about the Mexican-American War and leading up to the Civil War.
You mentioned that MLK said that this just allowed them to push everything back, but that's not unique. The U.S. has always pushed, things they don't really want to talk about back in favor of something a little bit more exciting. Hell, the founders knew that, pushing slavery was going to be a problem going forward, but they didn't really care.
That's a really good point.
It's actually kind of amazing that the country made it almost 100 years without a civil war, considering how much we like to push important issues down the line.
Yeah. Luckily, something that we don't have to worry about in the present, am I right?
No.
So starting with the founding of the United States and the idea of the frontier, it was actually our man Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s who is the first known person to conceptualize the frontier as a safety valve. He thought that people going west and expanding industry, as well as, agriculture and everything else, it would allow for the growth of American families, of wages, and of agricultural production, but without seriously needing to rethink the structure of U.S. society. Thomas Jefferson told settlers their movement west wasn't just a product of freedom, but the source of freedom. So there's this idea that it's not just that settlers have the freedom to move west. It's by moving west, they are creating more freedom, basically.
Thomas Jefferson is quite easily the stupidest smart person in our country's history.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
He has ideas that in theory make sense, but gosh, man, he loves him some freedom. It's almost a catchphrase to him more than anything else.
Right.
The question is freedom for himself or freedom for everybody? Sounds like the former.
Yeah, freedom for who, right?
He had land beyond the Appalachians, I think.
Yeah, he was actually a land speculator, as were most of the founding fathers. And that actually is a really good transition into the next point.
He sucked at it, though.
Yeah, not very good. Not good, folks. Not good. So during the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, there was a bunch of issues that were debated. Stuff from wealth accumulation to interstate conflict, political factionism, bunch of different topics of debate while putting together the Constitution. Different founders proposed different things to kind of solve these different issues and these different contradictions. But the thing that kind of carried the day was a philosophy that James Madison called extending the sphere. Extending the sphere was putting everything on the back burner by extending the U.S. sphere, extending the territory of the United States, in order to allow more room to, as he put it, take in a greater variety of parties and interests without having conflict. So instead of having the original 13 colonies live within themselves and deal with their issues, the idea was, nope, just go west, extend the sphere, and that's going to create more room for more interests, and nothing could possibly go wrong.
Never forget that it's always the slave owners that want to keep pushing you west so you don't think about anything else.
Exactly.
They want you to remember dysentery and typhoid fever and in the cold Midwest.
Yeah, and they want you to think about it fondly. So with all of this idea of the frontier was actually really helpful, not just because the U.S. by itself was creating a new country, but this was also around the same time of the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, which was the slave revolt against the colonists there, and then the Spanish-American revolutions, where other people in the Americas were getting their independence from Spain, just the same way the U.S. was getting independence from Britain. Although the Spanish-American revolutions came in more so the early 1800s. But anyway, with all these different revolutions, to different extents, those other revolutions promised a fundamental reordering of society, completely changing the hierarchies that were in place. Did either of you want to talk about the French Revolution yet?
Thing is, we talk about the French Revolution. The French helped us out in the Revolutionary War, which put France in bankruptcy. And one of the big reasons why it happened, when we talk about like the Louisiana Purchase, that was more or less because Napoleon needed some money to get into his war against England, the rest of the other coalitions in Europe.
It's also important to note that the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, is a true peasant revolt. It is the lower classes of society rising up against a entrenched aristocracy that kept them down the entire time. The Founding Fathers don't want any of that. They were rich.
Exactly. And so the difference with the American Revolution is, like Nick just said, the Founding Fathers were colonial aristocracy. So while these other revolutions were promising a fundamental reordering of society, what the Founding Fathers wanted was, the hierarchy before was the crown at the top, then the colonial aristocracy that were in the colonies, and then, what we could call the middle class, and then the poor, right? And so what the Founding Fathers wanted wasn't to restructure that hierarchy. They wanted to just chop off the crown at the top and become the new top of the totem pole. Because of that, they were scared, basically, of these other revolutions. When the Haitian Revolution started, they actually asked the United States for support, and the U.S. completely ignored them because it was a slave revolt. And so what the promise of the frontier did was it helped give the average American a different conception of freedom. And it gave them the promise of being able to move westward to settle their own lands without having to talk about social inequality in detail. And especially in the wake of uprisings in the newfound United States, such as the Whiskey Rebellion.
The Whiskey Rebellion is interesting because it's the first chance that we get to see that classic American hypocrisy in action, because there's nothing in the Whiskey Rebellion that wasn't a rallying cry from the Revolutionary period, but this time the government was putting that shit down.
And from what I understand, I'm not an expert in this, the Whiskey Rebellion was more so led by laborers and farmers and, not the kind of aristocracy that the Founding Fathers were, but rather people at the bottom. And so, you can have these rich lawyers, merchants, and land speculators who are fighting against taxation, and that's fine, but heaven forbid it's the people at the bottom, right?
Most revolutions in history are generally top-down. The French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution are sort of very rare instances of bottom-up revolutions. And I mean, I still got to expand my knowledge of other revolutions. It's off the top of my head. I mean, the Russian Revolution as well could be another one of the bottom-up revolutions, I think. But it's just generally most revolutions are top-down. And we see the Whiskey Rebellion as the perfect example of American Revolution being a top-down revolution where the colonial elites want all the power and they don't want to share it with the rest of the population.
From my understanding, most revolutions are kind of a mixture of all classes, but then a lot of the times, not always, but a lot of the time, the people who are kind of toward the top but not at the very top are the ones who kind of come out making the rules. The Mexican Revolution, for example, it's bottom down, top up, it's every direction. But anyway, some idealists actually felt that the frontier was a good thing too, for different reasons. Even abolitionists, they thought moving westward and creating small farming communities could create a wider base of communities that were detached from and opposed to slavery. So everyone is getting in on the frontier ideal, or at least almost everyone, because there were people who were opposed to expansion. Sometimes for noble reasons, not wanting to encroach on native territory. Sometimes just because they thought that like expansion would lead to downfall. And so it wasn't anything noble, but just them seeing being anti-expansionist as a form of self-preservation for the country.
You see empires fall when they start to expand, because that means more money. They have to have bigger lands, and it just turns into kind of like this one big just shitstorm.
Exactly. And that's how a lot of them saw it, because the founding fathers were incredibly well read and they were inspired by the Enlightenment. They kind of had that view of history where things would get bloated if it got too big. We rightfully think of the founding fathers as really bad when it came to Native Americans, because they were. They had this sort of conflict or contradiction where, like, on the one hand, they were inspired by the Enlightenment. They saw themselves as responsible stewards of the land, and part of that came with conducting yourself with some sort of set of principles, right? And so a lot of the founding father presidents, the first 5 or 6 presidents or so that we had, they signed treaties with the Native Americans. But again, a lot of local and state governments often ignored them, and then these same presidents would also use deceit and coercion. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson signed a lot of agreements with Native American groups, but he also used the federal government to encroach on their lands and strike deals with them that were like basically predatory debt lending, where they would push their trading houses, which were these predatory debt schemes, take advantage of native tribes who have their own ways of doing stuff, didn't really have like a big financial system because they didn't need it. They lived like sustainably off the land. And so these trading houses would like force the Native Americans to settle and then put them into debt that would force them to sell their land in order to basically not go broke. There's this weird balance of the founding fathers being, we are, of course, enlightened and principled, and we're going to respect treaties, but then at the same time, still taking advantage of and displacing people from their lands.
I just want to add, since we're talking about Jefferson, and the big thing with Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, to more kind of heighten that kind of American hypocrisy. Jefferson, in his particular beliefs, did not actually believe he had the authority to do it, but he ended up doing it anyway. So basically, in this instance, expansion towards the frontier was more important than his own personal political beliefs.
Which is also connected to his beliefs on slavery, right? Because wasn't he kind of like theoretically against it while he continued to benefit from it?
Basically, he knew in his heart that slavery was wrong, but he benefited from slavery. Washington was the same way. If you read what we do have of him, he understood slavery was wrong. He just didn't care.
Yep. Of course, we're talking about the founding fathers right now who acknowledged this contradiction, and even though they didn't act on it, it did weigh on them. But Pop Quiznik, who's the president after the Founding Fathers Coalition, who didn't give a shit about this stuff and just thought racism to the wall was the answer.
No, John Quincy Adams was too cool for that. I'm going to go with Andrew Jackson.
We have ourselves a winner, folks. So,
Caroline's favorite president.
Nick is like ducking right now to make sure she doesn't like slap him across the forehead, as she should.
The $20 bills don't make sense anyway, too. So
he was anti-bank, anti-paper money, and he's on the $20 bill. And there are people who are upset that we're thinking about taking him off the $20 bill. Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
As a brief aside, one of the things that like is a debate in history is, like obviously a lot of these people are like bad by today's standards, but you gotta judge them by their day's standards. I don't know if I believe that necessarily, but let's just say that we did. Jackson was a fucking insane racist by the standards of his day.
It's what makes it worse about Andrew Jackson is just how important he is in American history. He is one of the, if not taking aside what his policies meant, his importance to American political history, the presidency, and just the era in which he was responsible for makes him one of the 5 or 10 most important American figures of all time. And he's a piece of shit.
Yep. Super influential. And, before we get into what he did, there's a story that Gray Grandin mentions in his book that, like, perfectly sums up who and what he was. He's walking through this river valley on the Tennessee-Mississippi border while he's guiding a procession of bound-up enslaved people. right? People that he's transporting to use as slaves to a plantation. He comes to a checkpoint and he's asked for a passport. And the person asking for his passport is someone who works for those like debt peonage houses that Jefferson employed against the natives. So this is no leftist or idealist or whatever, right? No abolitionist, no friend of the Native Americans. But there are at least some agreements for sovereignty for native land, and so people passing near that area have to have some sort of passport to pass through. Now, what happened in response to that request for the passport is debated. The two most popular and widely believed counts is that instead of whipping out a passport, he whipped out a copy of the Constitution with a flag waving in the background, basically, and him saying,
God.
"This is the only passport I need, buddy, the American Constitution." The other one, which, I mean, honestly sounds like even more Jacksonian to me, he pulls out twin pistols and says, "This is my passport," and barges through the checkpoint.
That sounds like the Huntington Beach coronavirus protesters in a nutshell.
Oh, dude, the paranoid individualist populism of Jackson is like 100% present today. But we could talk about that for an hour. I know I certainly could. So
Jackson is the patron saint of that, is basically the point you need to know.
Exactly, yes. Jackson
the patron
is
saint of America.
He is the patron saint of like paranoid, racist, hyper-individualism. And so whatever exactly happened during this encounter, he did eventually get through. But he campaigned for the person who worked that checkpoint, again, no friend to the natives, to lose his job, and he also directly threatened that guy with mob violence. He also, in a letter to a friend right afterward, asked, "Are we freemen or are we slaves?" for being asked to present a fucking passport. Oh. And so his view was that the frontier should be a place of freedom for basically white people to engage in the slave trade, to displace native folks as much as they want, and just unrestricted and unbound by rules of any kind. So for him, the only social contract was, if you're white, do whatever the hell you want.
Sounds like Mad Max Fury Road.
Right? Yeah, and so he takes that paranoid frontier individualism, and it really guides his entire military and political life, including his presidency. Anytime he had power, he used it to crush natives and support slavery in the name of frontier freedom. And so the Founding Fathers Coalition, and so when I say the Founding Fathers Coalition, I mean the presidents who like directly were Founding Fathers, as well as people like John Quincy Adams, one of our most underrated presidents, who was not exactly a Founding Father, but is part of that ilk. The Founding Fathers Coalition saw Jackson as basically a violent maniac who could not be trusted to run the government. And then Jackson, in turn, saw them as weak-willed people who lacked the conviction to go all the way to fully settle the frontier.
Jefferson famously called Jackson a madman.
Yep.
Basically, like, he's just the unhinged, outspoken person. I'm trying to explain this. Like, he is masked off.
Exactly.
Founding Fathers Coalition.
Exactly.
So it's like he's just outwardly speaking the beliefs of the Founding Fathers Coalition. The Founding Fathers Coalition is like, shh, you're a madman.
Exactly. Fortunately, in the present, we don't have any leaders who are mask-off manifestations of the worst parts of the leaders who came before him. That is, fortunately, a fantasy that has no basis in reality. Anyway, when Jackson won the 1828 election, his inauguration was packed with white frontiersmen and agricultural workers, which the Founding Fathers Coalition and like the Whigs and stuff, basically his opposition, feared could lead to violent upheaval in different directions because they didn't like the super paranoid, aggressive frontier individualism of Jacksonianism, but they also feared that it could lead to class conflict as well. Jackson, though, didn't really have interest in class conflict because of his politics. And so he promised as president to bring back, in his own words, primitive simplicity and purity. And he said that government should be limited to a general superintending power. So this allowed him to expand individual political rights, but still, he made sure that the government wouldn't do anything to stop displacing native people or stop the slave trade or even create social and economic rights for people. So, Nick, what are some of the main political rights that Jackson brought?
Well, Jackson's presidency and really the Jacksonian age is synonymous with the full enfranchisement of white men. Up to this point, the founding fathers are consistently heralded as these saints of democracy, but if you go back and look at it, they didn't really care for democracy too much because the people who were allowed to vote in the first few elections, you had to be white, which has always been an important aspect of voting in America. And you had to have land. You had to have something. You had to be basically a status. You had to have status.
You had to be a property gentleman.
Because wasn't it the idea that, I'm not sure what president said it, I think it could have been Jefferson, that if voting enfranchisement went to the regular people, then the bosses could influence their vote.
I think so. Although I do know that the idea of having only a certain amount of people or certain kinds of people vote was a Hamilton idea.
It sounds like something Jefferson would say because he was one of the big advocates for, like, if you own land, you vote.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. But the biggest thing is, that white adult men can vote now. That's the most important thing, and that spurs Jackson's victories. It spurs his re-election. It spurs his enduring popularity. And it basically is the reason why the age is defined by him. That's really the most important thing you have to know, because by that helps define the era. Not so much for anything else other than that meant that because of that, and because Jackson was the face of that, you had to reckon with what Jackson's personal beliefs. I think it's also important to know, if you're trying to parallel moments in history, that Jackson was able to be a man of the people despite the fact that he is a wealthy plantation owner. Yeah, in the West, so I know he's more new money than he is the aristocracy, but he's still a wealthy person. He was able to turn his military victories and his general persona, because he was a charismatic individual, to becoming a voice of the voiceless, essentially. That is exactly the playbook that Trump would use in the 2016 election. A wealthy billionaire turned himself into the voice of the people.
Well, because it's almost like he's the outsiderish figure, too. Trump was outside of this, like, political
elites.
Jackson kind of posing himself as someone beyond that. Jackson being in, like, trying to remove himself from that made him attractive to the people as well.
Yeah. It's also important for a further parallel that think about the opponents in each of those elections. Jackson defeated not only the sitting president, but the son of a former president. Trump defeated the wife of a former president, considered a political dynasty. In both instances, they were able to go deeper layers of entrenched establishment, set themselves up as the outsider man of the people.
Yeah, which is so funny because, like you said, they are the establishment, but they were able to capture that image of being outside of it.
Yeah.
So what's really important about all this, too, is this was all happening during the time that the U.S. was starting to industrialize. And so during this time, more people than ever were wage workers. And obviously, most wage workers are either in poverty or just above the poverty line. And so they started to create workers' associations. People started to collaborate, get organized. But the 1830 Indian Removal Act cleared about 25 million acres of native land, which provided an area for white settlers to move west instead of organizing among themselves. You have this burgeoning creation of industry, you have the increase of wage workers, but instead of them really being able to come together, they are further diffused over a wider area, and especially into the agricultural frontier, where they do not organize because farmers do not really organize in the same way, because your main opponent on the day-to-day basis of being a farmer is not your boss. It is starving and not being able to grow enough food to eat. Whereas when you are a wage worker, and your boss is screwing you over, that's when you turn to your coworkers and you're like, hey, this shit sucks. We should form a union. We should form a workers' association. But when you're on the frontier, that's not your reality. And so that's why the frontier was serving as a safety valve for people coming together.
But then also you see urbanization as well. Because when these industrial centers start growing, more and more people are going off the farmland into the cities. So it's almost like counteracting the whole idea of frontier stuff as well.
Yeah, so you see the emergence, but then that promise of the frontier is there. And so you always have that idea that you can move west if you need to. And so during this time, actually, the idea of the frontier becomes a popular subject in the cultural imagination of the US. One description, for example, says that a life in the open air, freedom from restraint, and a vigorous appetite make difficult a return to the humdrum of steady work and comparative respectability. So you have the frontier as both a reality where people can move to, and then also as an idea of, oh, well, if things suck for me, instead of forming a union, I have the ability to move west.
Yeah, we'll see the West, that's idea even play up even into the 20th century when films start becoming popular. What is the endearing American myth? It's the Western, which is all about rugged individualism and pushing forward.
Yep. Go west, young man, and grow with the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is also a time period where I mentioned before that Benjamin Franklin had come up with the idea of the safety valve. He was the first one to really use that metaphor. But this was when that metaphor kind of hit mainstream public discourse. People would say stuff like elections were the safety valve of the Constitution, the free press was the safety valve for discontent on the ground. And so some reformers even tried to say that reforms such as like fighting monopolies, making the justice system more fair, creating free universal education, that these reforms would also create more safety valves for our system. And so one of the biggest ideas that caught wind during this time was the idea of free public land on the frontier. And so that became a sort of debate of the early left and early right, you could say, as to like what the idea of free public land was meant to be. What we would call kind of the left of that time saw free public land as part of a greater promise for equality that would include things like land as a right for citizens, the abolition of predatory debtors and debt collection, equal rights for women, and the abolition of slavery. On the other hand, the right wing of the time saw free public land as more of a kind of like libertarian promise for free land for whoever could settle it, which a lot of the time was mostly large landowners.
Couldn't say it better myself.
And then, of course, there was the issue of slavery. And actually, a lot of people at the time who were all over the ideological spectrum when it came to slavery, they also saw the frontier as a safety valve for freed people. The racists didn't want freed people around to create employment competition for white workers, and the abolitionists and freed people themselves who supported westward migration thought it would help give freed people a chance to live in peace and not be surrounded by shitty people.
It's funny because there was a growing belief at this time that slavery would eventually like die itself out. At this point in the history of the country, I don't think we were doing slave trade anymore.
You didn't need the slave trade because you had generations of slaves being born. You didn't need that slave trade anymore.
Yeah.
And so like they thought it would die out, but it's like that was the main source of labor for the South.
Yeah.
It's fucked up.
It's amazing how the next, of course, what we're about to talk about, just the next 10 years of events just accelerates the slavery issue.
Yeah.
I mean, you have the Trail of Tears after all of this as well.
Yeah.
That was like during this time, yeah. And then, of course, you know, after the era of Jackson, these contradictions keep building, and that eventually puts us on a crash course toward war with Mexico. John Quincy Adams actually called this. He thought that the U.S. was becoming reliant on frontier racism to hold itself together. So he didn't just think that the frontier was putting off problems. He thought that frontier expansion and frontier racism was the identity that the U.S. was building itself around. He kind of had two fears: that perpetual war on the frontier would rip apart the U.S., failure that the wars would fail, Or his other fear was that it would succeed and it would permanently bind the country together just on the basis of racism and nothing else. And that it would be frontier racism that created unity among American citizens. He actually saw Indian removal as a prelude to war with Mexico. So he saw the Mexican-American War coming. He also saw the Civil War and the Spanish-American War coming. But that's something we'll get to in a little bit.
Underrated political figure in American history.
Yep.
The real one.
He was a real one. You know, he didn't get to accomplish too much because he had very egalitarian views that were just not shared by the system he was presiding over, but genuinely decent dude who actually we'll just get to this anecdote right now. In a classic go off king moment, Adams was speaking out against the Mexican-American War. He turns to James Polk, who would later be elected president, who owned slaves, and Adams asked, "Do not you, an Anglo-Saxon, slave-holding exterminator of Indians, from the bottom of your soul, hate the Mexican-Spaniard Indian, emancipator of slaves and abolisher of slavery?" For those who don't know, the Mexicans actually abolished slavery way before the U.S. anyway. Going back to our man Adams, "Is your southern and southwestern frontier not sufficiently extensive? Are you not large and unwieldy enough already? Have you not Indians enough to expel from the land of their fathers and to exterminate?"
The answer to that question was no. Polk won the 1844 election on the promise of further expansion west. There is no president probably in the history of this country who believed in expansion quite like Polk did.
Yep, and surprise, surprise, he won the election on that promise like he just mentioned, saying that everything would be peaceful, and declared war on Mexico in 1846.
And basically give the blueprint for Wilson in 1917 to promise peace, but then go to war.
That's a great connection. I'd never made that connection before. Nice one,
Well,
Nick.
it's how many years have we not fought war in this country? I feel like we're at war every year. It's who we got to fight next?
Yeah, and if you mix in coups and things that are technically military interventions and not wars, but are basically wars, you add those in too, and we're always fighting and shit. And so with the Mexican-American War, even people from the war who fought on the side of the U.S. were made uncomfortable by the heinous violence that went above and beyond wartime norms. General Winfield Scott, witnessing a massacre of villagers that included children, said what happened would, and I quote, "make heaven weep and every American of Christian morals blush for his country. Murder, robbery, and rape on mothers and daughters, in the presence of the tied-up males of the family, have been common all along the Rio Grande."
That's gross.
Yep. Future President Ulysses S. Grant said it was one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation.
Also, fun fact about Grant, hated the sight of blood.
Really?
Yes.
Did not know that. Yet he was a great general. Who knew?
One of the greatest military minds, at least in terms of on battlefield stuff, in American history, hated the sight of blood.
Damn.
Well, I mean, Napoleon always wore cologne because he didn't want to smell death on the battlefield.
Oh, man. So the Mexican-American War, it had widespread support both because of racism against Mexico, which was perpetuated even by newspapers in the so-called Enlightened North, and because many Jacksonians wanted to further expand the frontier. In fact, some of them actually wanted all of Mexico.
They could have had all of Mexico if they really wanted to. The U.S. marched fairly easily into Mexico City. A little interesting tidbit about that. When it was becoming apparent that the war was coming to an end, Polk, a Democrat, didn't want a Whig to be the one to conquer Mexico City, so he kept looking for generals to be the one to lead the army into Mexico City, but he couldn't find any.
So he was looking for a successor to set up, basically.
Yeah, because Polk promised when he won nomination and election, he was going to do everything he set his goals to, and then not run for re-election. And he is one of the few presidents to do that, follow through on every one of his promises, and then say, yeah, I'm not running for a second term.
That would be super noble if it wasn't horrifying.
He also died like 5 months after he left the office. He was an incredible workaholic.
Ah, damn. If only he were a workaholic for good. But anyway, so U.S. wins in late 1847, signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that gave the U.S. the Southwest. And so this gave Jacksonianism a huge boost because people of all classes fought on the frontier against the Mexican army, and now they were victorious together. And so war, kind of like the frontier, served as a promise for socioeconomic mobility and stability. War kind of became that too. It became a way for people of different classes to come together and for people from the bottom of the rung to get some socioeconomic mobility and security. So war became another safety valve for avoiding class conflict in the US. Now, to compare this to Europe, on the exact same day, coincidentally enough, that John Quincy Adams died in 1848, labor uprisings started in Paris that spread all over Europe. These uprisings were put down, but they forced the ruling classes to pay attention to the workers. And so this was sort of like the seeds of the labor conflict and labor organizing that would lead to labor unions, labor parties, and social rights. The US, though, wasn't experiencing this in nearly the same numbers because there was still some labor organizing happening, but it wasn't in the same numbers because the expansion of the frontier through the Mexican-American War served as a safety valve for class conflict while also uniting Americans against a common enemy in the form of the Mexicans.
Before I take it off, Cameron, you have something you wanted to add?
I feel like just somehow these what we consider these empires, these countries that they use warfare as a means to, again, distract people from domestic policies. If you're able to coalesce your citizens around an enemy, you focus on that enemy. We look at Rome; they were expanding all over the place until 117 AD, and so when you're in war, you give the people an enemy to look at, so that again they could be distracted from domestic policies because everything is focused on one group of people. Basically, they didn't go into the revolutions of 1848 as hard as Europe was. And then you also said the rise of Karl Marx as well, and communism and very worker-centered philosophies.
Yeah, honestly, the Marxism could only have come out, well, not only, but he started his stuff at the perfect time because this part of the 19th century was very conservative, very liberal in its economic leanings, and it needed a pushback, and Marx was on to something. It wouldn't be put into practice for another almost 100 years, but it was still, like, the seeds were set there.
Yeah, and real quick side note to what Nick said for our listeners out there, you've probably only heard liberal to mean, like, left of center in American politics, but liberalism as an economic philosophy, I know it's counterintuitive, but it actually means free market conservatism, basically.
What we consider like a libertarian in American society.
Yeah. We don't need to go into that too much, but just for the listener to know, when you hear stuff like liberalization of the markets, that actually means free trade and stuff, and going just in favor of like deregulated free market stuff.
The important thing to take from the Mexican-American War, though, is the increased territory meant that we need to talk about slavery again, because one of the things that was important at this time is the balance of power created by the slave and free states. But we're going to have to backtrack a little bit before we can continue on.
Go off, King.
First thing is the Missouri Compromise. This goes back to 1820. When trying to admit Missouri as a slave state, the northern free states, I'm sorry, I reversed that. Maine was trying to be added as a free state, but the southern states were not going to allow that balance of power because I believe there was a perfect balance at the time. So they countered with Missouri, and then the northern, it started this big fight over admitting states to the Union. Eventually, the compromise was met, and they were both added at the same time, roughly around the same time, to keep that balance of power. This issue would come up again just 35 years later with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You guys have heard the term Bleeding Kansas, right?
Yep.
No, I haven't.
So there was fighting amongst the Kansas, Missouri, that area. Basically, the country decided that popular sovereignty was going to decide whether a state was admitted as a free or a slave state. So people with Southern sympathies moved into that Missouri area as this is going to be a pro-slavery state. To counter that, people from the North moved in.
Oh my goodness.
And this started a border war, a legit, basically almost like a proto-civil war between them, where people fought and people died. Eventually, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was signed, admitted Kansas in and Nebraska slave in, basically maintained the balance of power. That's all you really need to know about that. Although it also is important because it was Bleeding Kansas, along with a couple other things, that one of the things that motivated Abraham Lincoln to get back into politics. He had been out since he lost his re-election for Congress. And it was actually Stephen Douglas who was the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was the basis, at least the starting off point, for the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Damn, I had no idea.
So basically, that was the thing. The U.S. had a rule that no slave state could be had below, I believe, the 33rd parallel. I gotta check the parallel number exactly. So,
if it's
Missouri,
parallel 34, you're in trouble, bro.
I mean, Missouri was a state in the Union that was a slave state. So
it ended up being a border state. It didn't actually secede from the Union. So now we have all this territory, and we have to have a legit conversation about what to do with it. Texas was admitted into the Union. Actually, Texas's annexation and admission to Union is what the powder keg that started the Mexican-American War. So states like California, which was admitted as a free state, basically, the South had problem with the popular sovereignty idea because generally, when the votes were allowed to happen, the states tend to be admitted as a free state. So they always cause a ruckus in terms of admitting states into the Union.
So essentially that legacy of not being a fan of the popular vote, because they know they would get outvoted, and slavery would get whittled down.
Yeah, and the people who were against the Mexican-American War, there were a lot of people who were against it for moral reasons, but a lot of them were of the belief that the expanding territory would further the slavery question, which it did. It led us all the way to the Civil War.
Spoiler alert, the Union wins.
The Civil War, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, was about slavery. I believe 11 of the 15 states listed slavery in their secession.
That could mean anything.
It's states' rights, bro.
Yeah, as Cameron pointed out, the Union wins. The South never really had a chance. Yeah, early in they had more victories because they had a lot of the military leaders of the Union before the Civil War were Southern men. They had Southern allegiances, so that's kind of what happened. But the U.S. is better set up for the North was better industrialized. Lincoln, for what it's worth, is a better leader than Jefferson Davis, and the centralized government aspect of the U.S. kind of is overlooked because the South tried to have that kind of confederacy that didn't work when the country was first formed.
That makes sense.
The South was also trying to bank on getting French and British support in the war as well.
Yeah, but the Civil War is just actually, in terms of talking about the frontier, the expansion stops at this moment to start this fight. So.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to this idea of the frontier, right? Because according to Jackson Turner, the frontier should have avoided all this, but really what it did was it avoided the problem until it built up and hit a critical mass that, like, if this happened when it was just the 13 colonies, it probably would have been a lot less horrifying and had less of a body count.
Woulda, shoulda, coulda, didn't.
Yep.
Turner was an idealist.
Yep.
It's simply an origin story, but yeah, go ahead.
So after the end of the Civil War, the question became, what do we do with the South which includes the slave states, both of the original colonies and the frontier slave states. Reconstruction was the answer right afterward. And so Reconstruction sought to use the Freedmen's Bureau, which was a government agency set up to help freed people in the South, to basically restructure the society as a whole in a way that made everything more equal, and that actually, funny enough, the Freedmen's Bureau helped poor white laborers almost as much as it helped freed people. And so what the Freedmen's Bureau did was it protected freed people from violence because there was a shit ton of mob violence against the newly freed folks. It gave out food, clothes, and medicine, again, also to poor white people in addition to freed people. It created schools, colleges, and hospitals. It helped resettle people. It made laws in the regions that their offices were set up. It regulated labor relations and minimum wage. Because with the labor relations thing, they basically wanted to make sure that what replaced slavery in the South wasn't just slavery with another name. So that's why they're regulating labor relations and the wages. It also levied taxes against Southern planters and stuff. And so basically all of this was done in service of restructuring society to make it more fair. And again, even for white laborers, not just free people of color. In practice, the Bureau was underfunded and under-resourced, but despite that, it did achieve a pretty impressive amount given the limited stuff it had to work with. And it served as a really powerful symbol.
Probably the minute they realized that it was the Freedmen's Bureau could provide some level of class consciousness for freedmen and poor whites, they were like, yeah, we can't put money into this.
Exactly. And actually, that is part of what helps break it apart. Part of what breaks it apart is the fact that even though the Jacksonian Coalition as a formal political force is broken at this point, that sort of super individualistic, racist frontier paranoia that was the guiding ideology of Jacksonianism basically still was around, and it formed the opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. And so, as society in the South was being restructured to be more fair to both freed people of color and poor white people, the opposition was basically saying, hey, we can't let the government control us and force us to think of people of color as human beings.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's when you have the Redeemers and the Democratic Redemption coming around.
That's right, yeah.
Because you see the whole idea of sharecropping.
For someone who's never heard the term Redeemers, could you explain just what that means real quick?
So what a Redeemer was, that it was a person in the South. This was a response to Reconstruction. And these Redeemers wanted to make life miserable for freedmen. They stepped up lynchings. That's when you see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan around this time as well. And so if they wanted to fight back against Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau, they started to make life hell for freedmen and former slaves.
And so that's the force you see against Reconstruction in the South. In the North, going off of what Nick was saying a second ago, in the North, we have industry expanding westwards, with wealthy land speculators and large private industries growing in size and power on the western frontier. And so with that, the Republican Party, which is kind of simultaneously, it's the party of the North, and so it is the party of civil rights at the time. It is also, however, the party of industry, of big business. Yeah. And so, like Nick was saying, as the Freedmen's Bureau is restructuring society in a good way, one, that's a little bit scary to the industrial bosses in the North, and two, honestly, a lot of the effort and funding for Reconstruction was just starting to seem less important as the Republican Party was becoming more focused on industry and big business and kind of representing that as opposed to civil rights, basically.
GOP doesn't survive as a party unless it fully embraces becoming the party of industry.
Yep. And going back to the idea of frontier as a safety valve, as Reconstruction was losing steam, we had President Grant, who wholeheartedly supported Reconstruction and was pretty depressed that it was starting to lose steam. But he started contemplating acquiring the Dominican Republic due to the just insane amount of violence that freed people of color were facing. And so you see that, when things are going wrong, again, what's the answer? It's expanding the frontier. When these free people of color are facing this violence, and Reconstruction just isn't holding up in the face of big industry and, in super paranoid individualism in the South, the possibility that he considered was acquiring the Dominican Republic just to give freed people of color a frontier of their own where they wouldn't be facing just all of these horrors.
And no Dominican cigars as well.
Yeah, right?
Well, it's funny. It's not even the first time that idea has been brought up. Monroe was going to have Liberia and push freed people there because it was easier to acquire Liberia and put black people there than face any issue.
Exactly, yeah. Easier to take more land, even of a faraway place, than to have the U.S. try to settle its contradictions at home.
Never mind at that point, every black person in America probably had no inkling of Africa at all. They were Americans.
Exactly. And so we kind of shift back to the West now. Popular cultural imagination is of the West during this time as populated by these rugged individual settlers who went there on their own, struck it out by themselves, and they gradually, bit by bit, built up small towns and farms. Which is true a little bit, but also the reality is that the frontier was cleared by the government, especially through these wars and through horrific violence against the native population. And then a lot of these lands were bought up by the rich, and so cowboys aren't these lone heroic figures. Rather, they are these hired hands of large agricultural estates, basically. This time in the West, again, was the time of the final push of the U.S. against the natives. This was the cleansing, using their words, of the frontier. And that largely, that violence against native and indigenous people in the late 1800s Western frontier is basically what created most of the current boundaries and reservation systems that we have today in the U.S. In addition to that was the passing of Homestead Acts, which were acts that granted Western lands for people to settle at low prices. It was advertised as laws that would help the common man, and in fact, a slogan for politicians who talked about these Homestead Acts was, "Vote yourself a farm. Cast a vote for me, you get yourself a farm." In practice, though, like I kind of mentioned above, it was really a lot of large land speculators, agricultural businesses, railroads, oil tycoons, and other wealthy figures that usually got the largest and most fertile tracts of land.
Of course.
Of course, right? Even our frontier thesis boy Turner, he feared that this growth of what he called money power had started to exercise a unified control over the nation's industrial life.
Like he didn't think this was ever going to happen. It's like, Jesus Christ. It's like all of what happens in the East gets shifted out West. I mean, credit to him for, writing a narrative story, but my God.
Yeah, the impression I get from him is he was just kind of naive, honestly. I get the feeling from reading his stuff that he actually somehow believed this stuff. And then as the frontier is coming to an end, as things are starting to get tense, he's like, "Oh, geez, guys, I don't know if all this was a good idea."
He's from fucking Wisconsin.
So, before the Spanish-American War pops off, as we were kind of talking about a second ago, this was a time of incredibly, honestly, just really high tension in the U.S., and especially between labor and industry. Because now the frontier isn't really serving the same purpose, right? It's not a physical place as much anymore. Yes, not all of the U.S. is settled and turned into, towns or anything like that, but that popular idea of the frontier is fading. So there are incredibly intense strikes between labor and industry during this time, and that included bosses calling in private militias that would massacre strikers, and other times not directly use violence, but use intimidation and non-lethal force. The country is in crisis, and a lot of people in the U.S. feared that with the frontier no longer there to put off people's problems, chaos would reign. And that's where the Spanish-American War comes in.
And are things going wrong? Is your country starting to fight? Starting to realize that the problems are internalized? Go to war.
Exactly. And so in 1898, the U.S. declares war on Spain, which they had been vilifying for a long time. And of course, our boy John Quincy Adams, right again. So the Spanish-American War mobilized the U.S. against the Spanish, and it helped give the U.S. new purpose while also expanding the idea of the frontier beyond the shores of the U.S., which is really important, right? And so the frontier isn't just the continental United States anymore.
This is the first time in history where we see the blown up ship trope.
Yep.
This is
because we see that in Vietnam as well.
Yeah, this is basically the final form of not the final form, but the final form of this frontier expansion. The U.S. had expanded as far as it could on the continent without, Canada and Mexico. That was never going to happen. At least not all of Mexico. What do? The U.S., which famously broke away as a colony, decides to get into the colony game.
Exactly. And so by the end of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. had gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories, and Cuba as a protectorate. And so our boy Teddy Roosevelt, who participated in the war, said, "We cannot, if we would, play the part of China and be content to rot by inches in ignoble ease within our borders." So, we can't be like China and just have our civilization grow without expanding. We have to keep putting ourselves out there. And also, the Spanish-American War was seen as a reconciliation of the North and the South. So a lot of soldiers from the South brought the Confederate flag as a so-called symbol of their heritage while fighting to show their dedication to the U.S. Parades were even held across the country, both during and after the Spanish-American War, with this theme of reconciliation. And actually, at some parades, veterans of the Civil War marched in their gray uniforms. A popular poem at the time said, "Yes, sir, I fought with Stonewall and faced the fight with Lee. But if the Union goes to war, make one more gun for me."
Jesus Christ, the full rehabilitation of goddamn fucking traitors.
Yep. And this also helped quiet Northern opposition to Jim Crow laws that further entrenched the Black Code. So just real quick, right after the Civil War, right after the end of Reconstruction, the Black Codes were the racist laws that were brought against freed people of color. And then Jim Crow laws were started to further entrench those laws at the beginning of the 20th century. And so Spanish-American War meant that everyone was feeling good. And by everyone, I mean all the white people were feeling good, feeling united. And hey, we don't need to make a stink about Jim Crow, right? And so the aftermath. Like we said a second ago, the Spanish-American War set the U.S. on a trajectory of expanding the idea of the frontier beyond its shores. And so the frontier went from being something literal, physical, to being a metaphor. And so after the Spanish-American War, the Progressive Era, with like Teddy Roosevelt, Howard Taft, and Wilson, led to middle-class reform at home, but violent intervention abroad in the interest of expanding the frontier. During this time, the U.S. intervened in Central America, the Caribbean, and the Philippines, as well as a brief intervention in the Mexican Revolution, which didn't really go anywhere, but it did, it was still showing the U.S.'s willingness to intervene in things. And so for the rest of the 20th century, the frontier was a metaphor. During the 1920s, the frontier became a metaphor for market expansion, for example. During the Great Depression and New Deal, there was a little bit of a break in that because there became a recognition that the frontier had ended and there were now movements to create a society with social and economic rights. And actually, FDR himself said that life on the frontier is gone. Its simplicity has vanished, and we are each and all of us, whether we like it or not, parts of a social civilization which ever tends to greater complexity. And then his Secretary of Agriculture and VP for his, I want to say second and third terms, Henry Wallace, he said that new frontiers beckon with meaningful adventure. We must invent, build, and put to work new social machinery. So we can't look beyond our borders to try to put off our problems. We have to have some form of reckoning with our problems and trying to solve them in a social, interconnected way that helps people.
Yeah, fuck that. What we did instead was do things like expansion in different ways. Like, we needed to get involved in World War II to spread democracy. That was a form of pushing the frontier.
Exactly. And so World War II breaks that. And, there's very good reason to say that World War II was a good war. I personally believe that. But regardless, what World War II did do was expand the frontier against fascism, which again, I think that's great. But what it did also do was rebirth the idea of the frontier as the outside and the other. And then that leads also to the frontier after that being against communism.
Yeah, basically, just push on.
Yep.
Push on. American imperialism is less about us owning land now. It's about us influencing.
Exactly. Influence through culture, through money, through informal, quote unquote, political ties, but especially, in my opinion anyway, in my view of it, through money, through finance, through big business and all that.
Also, it goes back to this idea of the frontier, like the frontier being this huge buzzword. Like we see JFK talking about space as a new frontier, Ronald Reagan with free markets being a frontier, and then the internet being the electronic frontier. So there's always a frontier to expand towards.
Yeah, but no matter how much you think you can expand or want to expand, eventually you run out of places to expand to.
Unless you're Donald Trump and you want to make the United States of space.
Yeah,
a space army.
Yeah, so to close all this out, although you bring up a good point, Cameron, the author of the book that I read that spawned this whole conversation, Gray Grandin considers the border militarization that began in the 90s to symbolize the cooling down of U.S. ambition and growth. You know, like the frontier isn't anymore a place of unlimited potential and resources and stuff, right? But now we have the border wall. And that border wall really represents the U.S. kind of starting to close in on itself as it becomes a declining world power. And so the question is, do we find more frontiers? Is the frontier closed? I don't know. What do you fellas think?
I mean, the frontier closed a long time ago. We just kept trying to push it as far as we could.
I just think that we try to extend our influence around the world. So, you know, the frontier is closed, of course, in the United States, but we are trying to push it so far. And it's like a boomerang effect. So all the problems that have been created for this expansion beyond the frontier is hitting us right back at home now. And so we're reaping what we're sowing in terms of this conquest things. I mean, like, I always use Rome as an example because they expanded too far and they couldn't control it. Right now, we're on our farewell tour.
Well, look, the problem is eventually you can only push off your problems for so long, and eventually you have to face them.
Yep,
And
that's true.
The toughest enemy that you'll ever face is the enemy from within.
And that's true of politics. That's true of us as individuals. That's true of us in a group of friends. If there's problems you're putting off, like any human dynamic, whether individual or a group or anything like that, can only push off your problems for so long.
But yeah, that's the frontier.
Thank you for listening, everyone. If you haven't already, check out our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel now. We will be sharing links with all of that, on our pages. So check us out. Stay safe. And does anyone have any other parting words?
Leave us a 5-star review on the Apple Podcast page.
Or any page that you listen.
The more, the merrier. Yeah, we're doing the best we can in terms of keeping fresh content daily on our Facebook page.
The next time we get together, we're going to try something a little bit different, and we're going to review a historical film. It's going to be Dunkirk. Also, the next time we meet for a full episode, we are going to look... I think all of us are missing sports in some way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whether it's combat sports, team sports, something. So next week are going to talk about labor strikes in American sports.
I'm looking forward to it.
Including a long discussion about the effects of the 1994 MLB players' strike. So I think this was fun. This was interesting. Our first episode was segmented. The last episode was very much a lecture, and this one was very more conversational. So we've gotten a little bit different. It's been interesting so far.
Agreed.
We've gotten all formats. We'll probably have to do a live stream podcast here pretty soon. Yeah, it's been fun.
And if you're a listener out there, have a topic you would think that you would like us to discuss in any further detail, feel free to email us at amouthfulofhistory@gmail.com or hit us
And-
up on any of our social media pages.
Slide into our DMs, and we'll keep you into consideration.
Thanks,
Until
everyone.
then, next time. Have a good night.
Peace.
Peace. See ya.